Hello, world history. This is Mr. Janosiak coming to you from my home. This is the Russian Revolution, Part 3. If you are doing this at home, you can find the content on pages 288 to 290. We will finish the Russian Revolution tomorrow, and you will get another assignment with this lesson. So, we're going to continue where after the February Revolution of 1905, Nicholas II put in some tentative reforms to try to pacify the unrest that was going on in Russia. But remember that when the people called for a national legislature, he lets them have it. But then, because he does not like who the people vote for, he dissolves the Duma, which is the legislature. Well, you do not have much of a representative government if the authoritarian, the king, can just get rid of it whenever he wants to. And so that, along with further unrest in Russia, takes us to our content today. So, the reforms and crackdown that followed the revolution of 1905 slowed peasant disturbances, strikes, and other protests. For a time, a degree of calm returned to the empire. However, the complaints of the industrial working class had not been addressed, and tensions remained high. After 1912, violent strikes took place with increasing frequency across the empire. Many of them were efforts to improve workers' conditions. Strikers expressed the view that their goals could only be achieved with the overthrow of the monarchy. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 greatly influenced the coming of the Revolution of 1917, as well as the course the revolution took, its outcome, and the government that emerged. Russia was poorly prepared for the war, and it put an enormous strain on Russian society. Nearly 15 million men were called to military service. Of these, nearly 6 million had been killed, wounded, or captured by 1917. So, there was a tremendous pressure on Russia stemming from the mid 1800s through the early 1900s and the rule of Nicholas II, and then the extreme pressures of World War I are going to have drastic ramifications for Russia. Most Russians supported the war at first. That's nothing new, right? Motives like nationalism and imperialism had lots of common people supporting the outbreak of World War I. Violent strikes initially subsided. Patriotic fervor soon faded, however, as the Russian army suffered defeats and economic hardships developed at home. By 1915, war protests appeared in every social class. The protest increased in 1916 as the call-up of millions of peasants into the army reduced the food supply. The high cost of fighting the war caused prices to rise while workers' wages remained low. By late 1916, conditions on the home front had become grim. Worker and peasant opposition to the war and the government grew even stronger. Most upper and middle class Russians continued to support the war itself, but they became increasingly critical of the government. The February Revolution. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was actually two revolutions. The first, called the February Revolution, toppled a 400-year-old monarchy and established a democracy. The second, called the October Revolution, or the Bolshevik Revolution, brought even more drastic change to Russia. The February Revolution began in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, on February 23, 1917, when women factory workers, angered over the food shortages, protested having to stand in line for bread. They called on men at nearby factories to join them. Within days, nearly all workers in Petrograd were on strike. They were joined by students and members of the city's middle class. Troops called out to end the demonstrations refused to do so. Instead, many soldiers joined the protests. Meanwhile, the uprising spread to cities and army units across the empire. So remember in 1905, when the military was called to put the the uprising down, they fired on the crowd, and you got Bloody Sunday in 1905, and the power of the Tsar was upheld. Here, when the soldiers are once again called to fire on the peasants and end the demonstration, they refuse to do so. Nicholas II, who was away at World War I's Eastern Front, responded to the crisis by dissolving the Duma. However, it refused to disband. Instead, it formed a temporary government called the Provisional Government to rule Russia until a democratic assembly could be elected to create a new permanent system of government. Russia's top military commanders decided to support the Provisional Government in the hope that it could end the unrest that was hurting Russia's war effort. Having lost control of his army, his government, and his people, Nicholas gave up the throne. So initially, the military leaders support the uprising, hoping that it would help Russia continue to fight the war. Russia will, of course, surrender the war soon. Dual power. The provisional government tried to rule for the entire nation, but most of its members were from the middle class. Working class Russians instead placed their loyalty in the Petrograd Soviet and in similar councils called Soviets that quickly sprang up in other cities. In the summer of 1917, the leaders of these local Soviets united to form the All-Russian Soviet in Petrograd. The All-Russian Soviet and the local Soviets became a sort of second government for Russia. When they disagreed with the provisional government, they passed laws and issued orders on their own. This system of dual power contributed to the chaos that developed as peasants seized land, soldiers deserted, and ethnic minorities demanded self-rule. Imagine living under a system where two governments are putting forth two different contradictory sets of laws. This type of system is obviously confusing and not sustainable for people living in this society. The October Revolution. In April, Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin returned to Russia after 10 years in exile. He immediately called for the Soviets to overthrow the provisional government. However, the Mensheviks and other less radical revolutionaries controlled most Soviets. The Bolsheviks were in the minority. When Bolshevik workers and soldiers took to the streets of Petrograd in July 1917, the Petrograd Soviet refused to support them. Government troops easily ended the uprising. Events soon turned in the Bolsheviks' favor. By mid-August, the government's war offensive was going badly, and shortages of food and other goods had become severe. An increasing number of Russians supported transferring all government to the Soviets. All power to the Soviets became their cry. This caused Russia's more conservative elements, like the Cadets, to call for extreme measures. The government sent troops to seize the Petrograd Soviet. The attack collapsed, however, when Soviet members told the soldiers that they were being used to put the upper classes back in control. In September, the Bolsheviks began gaining majorities in some Soviets, including the Petrograd Soviet, the country's most important. They decided that the time was right to seize power. Lenin decided to overthrow the provisional government when the All-Russia Congress of Soviets met in Petrograd on October 25th. This plan made the revolt look like a takeover by all the Soviets instead of the act of a single political party. During the night of October 24th, Bolshevik soldiers quietly took control of bridges, telegraph offices, railroad stations, and other key points in the city. The next morning, Lenin announced that the government had been overthrown and that the Congress of Soviets had taken power. By the end of the day, the provisional government had surrendered. On October 26, 1917, the Congress of Soviets voted to approve the Bolsheviks' actions and formed a leadership council to head the new government. It put Lenin in charge and named Bolsheviks to other key posts. At Lenin's request, the Congress passed decrees giving all private land to the peasants and giving workers control of their factories. A second revolution had taken place with hardly a shot being fired, and Lenin had turned the people's demand for all power to the Soviets into a Bolshevik government. So Lenin, very cunning leader and revolutionary, even though he himself declares that the provisional government was overthrown, he then afterwards asks for approval by the Congress of Soviets, right? And they give it to him, and he himself becomes powerful in Russia, and you get the establishment of a communist government in Russia. So again, we will finish this tomorrow. And it's been nice to talk to you. If you have questions, or send me an email. Hope you are all doing healthy, well, and swell.